Good morning, everyone. This is Terry Behrens, the Executive Director of the Johnson Center for Philanthropy. I want to welcome you to the first of our three-part webinar series on using evaluative thinking in impact investment. This first webinar is on using evaluative thinking at the investment planning stage. I'm going to I'll go over a few reminders. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping items, and then we will get some information from you, find out who's on the call, and then turn it over to John Sherman, and then we'll launch into the webinar. So again, thank you all for joining. The Johnson Center is a university-based center. Our mission is to understand, strengthen, and advance philanthropy. We're seeing philanthropy changing rapidly in recent years with more emphasis on different ways to create social change outside of the traditional grant-making approach. And so we see impact investing as one of the fastest growing and potentially most impactful ways to make change. But too often we see social impact investors thinking more about the economic part of it, or maybe being better equipped to assess the economic return, but struggling a bit with the social return. So we're delighted to be hosting this conference, co-sponsored along with the American Evaluation Association, the Council of Michigan Foundations, and Mission Investors Exchange, so that we can help elevate the importance of assessing the social impact at various stages of the investment process. Again, a few housekeeping items. Everyone is on mute, so please use the chat function on your screen to ask questions or comments throughout the webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and we will email a link to all registered participants along with a copy of today's slides. Okay, and as I said earlier, I'm Terry Behrens, Executive Director, and I will be turning this over to John Sherman shortly. But first, we'd like to find out a bit more about who's on the call. So on your screen, you see a survey. We'd like to have you go ahead and click on the button that best represents the type of organization that you are with. I'll give everybody another few seconds to respond to that. And let's see. All right, so most of the folks on the phone, again, equal number of nonprofit organizations and consulting organizations represented. Some nonprofits, about a fifth of the people from nonprofits, and some others. Next, we'd like to find out if you're a member of the American Evaluation Association. All right, and a fairly even split there with folks who are familiar with AEA or are members of AEA. And then we want to find out what's your background? What is the area of expertise that you're bringing to this discussion? Okay, so we're seeing about half evaluators. Nope, now it's exactly half evaluators, and then a mix of programming staff, investment experts, and other administrative roles. Okay, thanks. Now I'd like to turn this back over to John Sherman to say a few words. Okay, I think it appears that we have perhaps lost him from the call. So let me say a few words about it. So our series of three webinars are designed to take us through the life cycle of a social impact, an impact investment that's designed to have a social impact. So today's will focus on the initial stages. How do you know when you're considering making an investment what the potential for social impact is? We have lots of well-developed approaches to doing due diligence on the economic return, but we know less about ways that, about ways to assess the social impact before it gets started. The next webinar is going to focus on the during the life cycle of the investment. How do you monitor that and track the social impact progress along with the financial returns that you're seeing? And then the final webinar will focus on the end game. How do you know what the results were as you wrap up your investment and either are withdrawing your money, cashing out, or considering a second investment? So we have some great speakers for today. There we go. We have Joanna Cohn, Veronica Olizabeth, Mike Muldoon, and Jane Reisman. Jane is going to be moderating today, so I am going to turn it over to her to take it from here.
Thank you, Terry. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we have you.
Great. With everyone this morning and having the first of our series sold out with everybody who wanted to join who couldn't is going to be able to get a recording later today, so that will be available to everybody. So please know that. But we're delighted to see this boundary-spanning webinar series and impact investing. And this first webinar is about using evaluative thinking at the social impact stage, at the early stage. Our presenters are from the Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and this report is to address this particular topic. The Associates Foundation is involved in out the impact of two or more each for this field with coin into when investing a thing. Set up to describe investments that are intended to generate social and environmental impact along financial returns. Foundations are using this as well as traditional investors and all kinds of new investors. It's relevant to the webinar because both relationships and are actively engaged with evaluation units and teams. And this is exception, not the norm, and found you typically work with the grant side of the house, and the measurement and investing is addressed differently. This separation is not peculiar to foundations. In a publication for the Rockefeller Foundation that a number of us, including Veronica, we talked about the side development of through both the public and sector compared to the private sector. So this historical action has been continuing out as except we're making these conscious attempts to bring these fields together. And a large part of that is because previously impact investing was using measurement primarily for accountability and public and social had evaluation as a function for learning and quality improvement as well. And the advent of impact and management is a huge growing consensus is in order to manage investments better. Also, IMM.
Excuse me, Jane. I'm sorry. This is Tori from the Justice Center. I'm just checking in. You're breaking up quite a bit. Is there anything? Are you moving around by chance?
No, I'm not. But
I think we should probably just go ahead and move on and have Joanna start.
Yeah. Look, if you can hear me, I can introduce the speaker. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that would be great.
Better. Thank you.
Okay. Let me go ahead and say that we have amazing speakers. Cohn, Senior Evaluation Officer at the MacArthur Foundation, And for her 5 years, she's been engaged in nuclear security, anti-corruption, Nigeria, journalism, media, and impact investing. Wide-ranging knowledge and working with different programs. I'm going to talk about her partnership with the team. And to the Rockefeller team, which is Veronica Olazabal, who is Director of Evaluation Performance, and Mike Muldoon, who's actually part of the impact investing team in the innovative finance team. And so without much further ado, let's start with Joanna Cohn.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this morning. I'll just pause briefly. Can you hear me? Am I breaking up?
You sound good, Joanna. Thank you.
All right. So before diving into how MacArthur integrates evaluative thinking into its impact investment activities, I thought it would be helpful first to contextualize that work within the larger frame of how MacArthur designs and implements its programming overall. So at MacArthur, we have 4 different types of programs or strategies. And these typologies, if you want to move the slide over a couple in to show the typologies of MacArthur's programs. These typologies are an outgrowth of a larger exercise the Foundation did that started about 5 years ago, which aimed to take a more rigorous approach to understanding the impact of the resources we deploy, whether that's through grants, program-related investments, or any other non-monetary support like technical assistance or convening power. And first and foremost, we recognize that regardless of the tool we're using, be it a grant or PRI, the issues that we're addressing are complex, dynamic, and ever-changing, and so too must our strategies in order for them to be effective. So we do that by, with the intention of designing our strategies to be iterative and responsive to the operating context. And that's what we call at the Foundation as DesignBuild. If you want to move to the next slide. And what helps drive our design-build approach to programming is that we collect information that's relevant and meaningful, both quantitative and qualitative, about the progress of our strategies and the environment in which they operate. And then we use that information to make decisions and adjustments. And so for every strategy, we develop a theory of change that ensures that all of our grant-making and non-grant-making activities are aligned with the social environmental goals that we're aiming to achieve. And then we collect information around that theory of change through monitoring and evaluation. And if you can move to the next slide. So as you see, our evaluation operates at the strategy level. So we don't evaluate an individual grant or individual PRI level. We are taking a look at the overall strategy that those individual grants and PRIs are contributing toward. So toward this end, an evaluation representative like myself, so someone from our Office of Evaluation, sits on the core team of every strategy to make sure that an evaluative lens is built into the design of that strategy, it's the implementation, and any adjustments that we make. You can move to the next slide. So you can see that one of the areas of the Foundation's work that I am involved with is our impact investments team. If you can move to the next slide, and I'll just pause briefly to explain give you an overview of our impact investments at the Foundation. So our impact investments work is divided into basically 2 streams of work. One focused on supporting our other existing strategies. So if, for instance, we have a strategy working on climate solutions, we're always asking the question, what are the resources that we have available to advance our strategy? Are they grants? Are they PRIs? Is it a combination of the 2? Then we also, our second stream is around supporting the impact investing field overall. And we do that through a combination of grants and program-related investments around targeted initiatives. And one of those initiatives that we recently launched is called the Catalytic Capital Consortium. And for that Catalytic Capital Consortium, we are taking the same approach that I described earlier. So we're developing a theory of change around that, and then we're also going to be evaluating it moving forward. If you can move to the next slide. And as we are applying our evaluative lens to any of our strategies, including impact investments like the Catalytic Capital Consortium, C3 for short, we have some guiding principles that we're always taking into that work, which you can refer to on this slide. I won't read them out explicitly. If you can move to the next slide. And as part of that core team, as someone who sits on the, works closely with the other departments for any given strategy like C3, there are a couple core services that I provide. So for every strategy, I'm helping them to, or my colleagues review our PRIs that we're making to, again, ensure that it's aligned with the overarching goals of the C3 initiative, and to help make sure that there are ways that we are, that we have ways in place that will be collecting information on a continuous basis to help understand if our strategy is making progress in the way that we expected, and if not, how we can use that information to inform adjustments to the design of the strategy. And one way that we do that is by hiring an external, what we call evaluation and learning partner that serves as a critical friend to the foundation. And that's usually in the form of a team of evaluation professionals, content experts, social science researchers that help us to pressure test our theory of change, making sure that the logic is sound and making adjustments if it's not. And then also to help design an evaluation framework for our strategy and our theory of change, so that we can very deliberately and rigorously collect information that will let us know if we are making progress to the results that we want to see, and also monitoring the environment within which the strategy operates, so that we can remain responsive to what's going on, recognizing that the strategy that we are advancing is only one piece of the puzzle. And so throughout it all, if you can move to the next slide. Throughout it all, we are, as I said, collecting information and using that information to inform our decision making. And throughout, our main focus for evaluation is on learning, right? So we are, instead of having a focus on accountability, so making sure that we are advancing in the way that we want to, or even trying to show signs of attribution between what the resources that we're deploying and the changes we see. We just want to make sure, we want to make sure that what we are putting out there is contributing to the ultimate changes that we want to see. And we do that by taking using contribution analysis and developmental evaluation to collect and analyze that information. And through the work with our evaluation and learning partners, if you can move to the next slide, we have a couple of kind of consistent deliverables that are produced across all of our strategies that help everyone at the foundation take a rigorous look at the way that we're designing and implementing the strategies. So that including a theory of change in both a narrative and visual form, an evaluation and learning framework, so it outlines the main questions that we're trying to answer, and then on the flip side, the information that is surfaced from our evaluation work, which come in the form of synthesis reports that we make available to the public, and that I've linked here as an example. You can find them on our externally facing website. And with that provides kind of an overview of how MacArthur is integrating evaluative thinking into all of our strategies, including our impact investing strategies. And I think I'll hand it over to Veronica. Okay.
Hi, this is Veronica, and we're actually going to start off with Mike from our investment side.
Perfect. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for having the foundation as a part of the webinar. I think before I have Veronica jump in on the evaluation and monitoring side, I wanted to just give some initial context around our impact investing portfolio here at the Rockefeller Foundation. So if you could please go ahead 3 slides, I think, to slide 23. Next one. Yeah, so just to give a little bit of context, I think the foundation's role in the broadly defined impact investing space has evolved since its inception. The early years of our work in this space, so if you look at the timeline here, really from 2007 to around 2012 or 13, was really focused on building out the broader impact investing ecosystem. So, of course, the convening at Bellagio to help coin the phrase, working with entities like B-Lab, GIN, and others to help kickstart the industry. And then around 2012, we pivoted from kind of an industry incubation role into actually deploying our own capital via primarily PRIs, program-related investments, which Joanna referenced. And what that looked like, I'll go into some of these points in more detail on the rest of my slides, but what that looks like today is a platform that we've developed within the foundation, which we are very confusingly on this call referring to as Impact Investment Management, IIM, not to be confused with IMM, which is all around playing a kind of catalytic role in the marketplace, not just with our own funding, but how can we partner with groups like we've done with MacArthur on a partnership, basically to expand, accelerate, and hopefully amplify our impact dollars beyond kind of the limited budget that we have within our own foundation. And so I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in the subsequent slides. So if we could go to the next page, please. So like Joanna and the MacArthur Foundation, we have kind of our core programmatic areas that we focused on. You see those listed here in the white boxes, from power on over to climate and resilience. My team is actively working with these program teams to structure not just PRIs, but also what we call innovative finance grants, also working with these teams to help integrate finance and investment thinking into their broader strategies, which is kind of an ongoing process and dialogue we have with the teams. The zero gap portfolio, which is kind of the second arrow you see at the top, is our kind of externally facing innovative finance portfolio. And really the zero gap program, which I have a subsequent slide on, is really centered on financial innovation and how do we create new products and mechanisms that can mobilize large-scale private capital against the SDGs. And so again, that's more of our external facing work. And then finally, all the way on the right here, as I referenced earlier, an actual asset management platform that we've created to bring some efficiency to the market of concessional/catalytic funding. Next slide, please. So this slide really we included just to give the group some sense of the diversity of our portfolio and how integrating impact measurement and evaluation needs to be flexible and kind of applicable to all these different asset classes, all these different sectors, all these different geographies. And so this just gives you a sense of where the foundation has invested over the last 10 plus years. You'll note that we have quite a large grant portfolio that we're including here, and that is because our zero gap portfolio that I referenced earlier around mobilizing private capital through financial innovation started out as a very grant heavy approach and is now transitioning into the impact side, and I'll touch on that, I believe, on the subsequent slide. So can we go to the next one, please? Yeah, so the zero gap program is really all around how do we close the acknowledged SDG financing gap. Obviously, the financing gap is well publicized. We're all aware of it. We're all striving to close it. The approach that our foundation has taken in order to close that gap is around product development. So how do we use our catalytic flexible funding, impact first funding, to catalyze and create new financial products and mechanisms that can speak to the risk return requirements of mainstream investors. And so as I mentioned on the previous slide, we started by doing grants. So different management teams, different fund managers would come to us with these new innovative solutions. We would basically put them through a filter, which we're including four characteristics here: impact, innovation, additionality, and scale. There's obviously a much longer list, but those are the really key kind of variables that we're looking at when considering these different grantees. We have 44, I think it's 46 now, active grantees in this portfolio. And just last year, in 2018, we pivoted from just making grants in this space to actually investing in these entities. And really the rationale there was we need to provide a continuum of capital for these new instruments as we're developing them via the grant portfolio. As they go to actually launch in the market, we need to have a PRI capability to help establish these new financing mechanisms in the actual marketplace. Next slide, please. So just a quick word on this IAM platform I mentioned. So this was really born out of our partnership with the MacArthur Foundation, where as part of the Catalytic Capital Consortium, or C3, as Joanna mentioned, we were fortunate enough to partner with the MacArthur Foundation to basically take this zero-gap thesis around financial innovation and bring it to scale. And so as a part of the C3 program, MacArthur provided some capital that was matched by Rockefeller to basically invest PRI capital into these new financial solutions as they go to market. And so that portfolio is kind of rapidly growing. We have, I think, 6 or 7 now investments in that portfolio. And as a result of taking in that funding from C3, the foundation had to create an appropriate asset management structure that could manage capital like any traditional fund manager would. And so that led to the creation of this impact investment management platform. And we're excited about the different things that we can do with this platform going forward. Next slide, please. So just finally, before I turn it over to Veronica for the more exciting stuff on the impact measurement side, just to give you a sense of some of the investments that we've done out of the both grant and PRI portfolios within Zero Gap. I'll touch on 6UP later, but I think it's a good one when we talk about impact measurement and evaluation. 6UP is a student lending business here in the U.S. that focuses on low-income students who are high-performing but simply don't have a cosigner, don't have a credit score, can't even access enough lending capital to get to attend college, even with Pell Grants and all the other funding support that they can get. And so you'll see the impact kind of linked to this deal that I'll go into some more detail later on in the discussion here. But really the one thing I'd point out before I turn it over to Veronica is you'll notice a lot of these we've provided both a grant and a PRI to. I think that has been a powerful approach and tool for us to use as a foundation to think about the life cycle of funding that these entities need and really bringing them from kind of an incubation stage into launching in the market with an actual investment that hopefully puts them on a more sustainable path to growth. So with that, maybe I'll stop. I'll turn it over to Veronica, and then I'll jump back in a few minutes with some additional thoughts on some of the portfolio companies.
Thanks, Mike. So if we can move over to slide 30, and as we're transitioning, as Mike mentioned, I myself think that his content is actually the more interesting part for this work, and so I think that speaks to this concept of partnership that we'll get back to further into the conversation. So I think where I want to start is zooming out a little bit and framing what is the value proposition of doing measurement and evaluation at the Rockefeller Foundation, as Joanna did earlier with the MacArthur Foundation. And we, in short, do it for 3 reasons. Number 1, it is the way that we generate learning and adaptively manage and track and continuously improve our work. And I think that is the piece that's closest to a concept that we haven't talked about much during this webinar, but around impact management that we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. The second is for accountability to our grantees and our beneficiaries, basically people all along our supply chain of philanthropy. And the third is to contribute to building the evidence base, particularly given our foundation's history in new areas. And so if we move to the next slide, as I mentioned, our the way that we think about measurement for our impact investing portfolio specifically, and the way that the industry is really thinking about it, is around this concept called impact management and measurement. And in short, what this concept is, and it's not real rocket science, but it's that we should be treating our impact and our social and environmental performance in the same way that we treat our financial performance. And so in order to do that, most accountants and most financial analysts will track the performance of their portfolios. In order to generate that impact, we also need to be tracking and managing the results of your impact piece. And that comes from a pretty norm convention standard now that was developed through a collaboration of many, over a couple of thousand stakeholders, now called the Impact Management Project, or IMP. If we move to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what our impact measurement and management approach is at the Rockefeller Foundation. So we basically break it out into 4 areas. And number one, we start off with, and I'll talk a little bit more about the detail in the next slide, but in short, number one, we start off with ensuring that we are defining and framing our impact, and really that's the intentionality piece that in the impact investing space we talk about often. Number 2 is we weave it into our various documentations and reporting tools. And number 3, we think about how we're going to analyze the data. And then number 4, really importantly, we talk about roles and responsibilities specifically. And so if you move to the next slide, really, this is where the rubber hits the road. And so a little bit different from what Joanna explained, where she talked a little bit about thinking about measurement and evaluation at a strategy level. We do that as well. One of the challenges, though, we've had and if you are monitoring and evaluation people out there, that you've probably had, is that when you get to assessing and evaluating your work, you don't really have a lot of very good quality data. And part of that challenge is because it probably hasn't been collected along the way. And so what we've been thinking in terms of how we manage our impact is to very much take the 5 dimensions of the impact management project, and the 5 dimensions being 5 areas where we're being very explicit about what type of impact we're looking for, who we're trying to impact, how much, and at what rate, and what is our investment's contribution, as well as the risk, and having those very hard conversations early on in our due diligence processes with our impact investing team. And so this concept of partnership that I referred to earlier is really key. We have to have a good, trusting, reliable, credible partnership in order to have these conversations really early on, and in order to, as an evaluation team, in order to be even invited to that part of the party. So if we move to the next piece, that is a little bit around how we frame our impact, and that also is a little bit around how we frame our impact at the deal level. And so the theory or the model you should be thinking in your minds is, if the pieces are all generating some kind of impact and you're being really explicit about how what it is you're prioritizing and what you will be managing, then at the end of the day, that should roll up into something, which would be our analysis around the portfolio piece. However, it's not going to happen, and as we know in the philanthropic space, this data collection is not going to happen unless we're really intentional about weaving it into our impact reporting and agreement requirements. And this is a must-have, particularly with our impact investing and PRI investments, given that no one wants to be held accountable because it costs money to report for something that might not be actually required. And so we spend time doing all of this front-loaded work because we want to make sure that it's explicit in our various agreements and that we're all managing towards the same type of expected impact. We also, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, we also spend time thinking about alignment to the SDGs in this process, as well as thinking a little bit around what contribution and attribution looks like, not from an evaluation standpoint, more from an investment standpoint at this point. Can we move to the next slide, please? So as I said earlier, where the rubber hits the road is when these indicators or metrics find themselves into an agreement. However, I have also seen this type of setup in other institutes, and hello, there we go. And what ends up happening is that we're not capturing the data. There's no place to keep the data, and so we're making sure that we have established a data repository, data capture system through an MIS to capture the data, and then to make sure that we're able to do the roll-up to the SDGs that I spoke to earlier. And this all the pieces, all the nuts and bolts as they're coming in, helps us as an organization to make data-informed decisions and to adaptively manage our work. Next slide, please. And then finally, this is a bit of our mapping out around when things happen and who is responsible for what, which is key to making sure that someone is the keeper to some part of this work. And so as you can see, some of the pieces are, that Joanna also mentioned around theory of change, et cetera, is in the swim lane of the measurement and evaluation team. And that is happening in tandem to what the PRI team or the impact investing team is optimizing for in terms of ensuring investee alignment. And that is happening during the pipeline development process. And so as this plays out, we would then know what we will be doing with the information once it gets into our databases and be able to manage the impact. And then at the end of the day, and something that you'll hear more about, and I think webinar 3, we'll be able to take a look back and assess our impact through an independent evaluation. And at that point, we would have already set ourselves up to at least have the data, and hopefully good quality data, that our independent evaluator might need in order to take a very responsible and thorough look, kind of like the way an auditor or an accountant would do for the financial side. So if you move to the next slide, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike, and he's going to talk a little bit about what this really looks like in practice on the finance side. And I think if you, this is to Jane and team, if you want to just let us know how much time we have, that'd be helpful. I'm going to take the silence as we have time.
Okay, great. So I can just go through these quickly, and Jane, do please jump in if you wanted to get to the next piece. But so as I mentioned, just to give you guys some context of like what this actually looks like at a deal level, as Veronica touched on a few slides back, it is a very integrated approach, and as Joanna mentioned in her slides as well, where we really are leaning on the expertise of Veronica and our team here to help us ensure that we're collecting the appropriate data to monitor and hopefully achieve the impact that not just at our team, at the impact investing team level, but also as a foundation and more broadly as kind of an active player in the industry. And so this gives you a sense of the types of indicators we're tracking in the 6UP investment across the 5 dimensions. One thing I want to point out here is that we invested both early stage equity into the actual company in addition to a mezzanine loan into a portfolio of student loans themselves. And so I think coming up with a set of indicators that can track across those different types of asset classes is obviously very relevant for a portfolio as kind of diverse as ours. And even within a transaction where you have multiple tranches, having indicators that are aligned with the business, so to Veronica's point, aren't going to be seen as being too burdensome or arduous for the business owner to collect, but that are legitimate, measurable, and kind of quantifiable in a way that is meaningful is kind of the middle ground that we're striving for. And I think the list of indicators here, I would say probably 3/4 of them were on the radar of the management of the company when we first invested, and the other quarter we worked with them to develop, and I think the feedback has been positive from their side as well, where they say, okay, we have a much more robust kind of approach to impact now, and it's been helpful as they talk with other potential partners in this space. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So I won't spend time on this, just given the clock, and I think LeapFrog as a fund manager is probably well known to lots of folks on this call. Our exact engagement was via kind of an innovative insurance product, but I think a group like LeapFrog, even as robust of an impact measurement and evaluation framework as they have, I still think there was some value add in the back and forth with our team helping to massage the indicators that they already had and adding some additional ones where we felt it was important or where there were some gaps that we saw where there could be additional linkages to the SDGs. Next slide, please. And so just carrying up on that last point, as Veronica mentioned, as a foundation, it's a priority for us to be able to track and kind of roll up our portfolio from a deal indicator level up to the SDGs. And so this just gives you a sense of how we're doing that across at least those initial 5 investments that we've included in this presentation, and kind of where we see those investments tying up to those SDGs. And really the way we've done this, again, it's a pretty intuitive process where we're looking at the SDG, we're looking at the SDG targets and indicators as provided by the UN and others, and are just being very deliberate in linking the indicators that we're tracking at a deal level to those SDG indicators and drawing those parallels whenever possible. And so this just gives you a sense of how we're doing that across these initial sets of investments on this slide and the next slide. And again, I won't go into all the details, but hopefully this gives you a practical sense of how some of these methodologies are being applied to an active investment portfolio.
And if we could jump to slide 41, I'll be very brief. As I mentioned, partnership is really key in this work, and it's important to spend time cultivating those partnerships, not just across own foundations, but across the space as well. And if this comes circles right back to our work with Joanna and her team at the MacArthur Foundation, it's really key that as we start to think about the way that we're going to be managing the impacts on people and planet, that we also think about ways that we can engage together differently in service to our global agenda around the SDGs. And so I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to the moderator for the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much. Really, well, I'm not quite yet. Appreciate your sharing the work of both foundations. We do have a few questions for you. First question. So in the impacts investing world, the term of art for measurement is impact measurement and management. We heard you using that terminology. Many of the evaluators are more familiar with the term evaluation in the social and public sectors. Is this just a difference in semantics and terminology, or are there really significant differences associated with those approaches? Impact measurement and management versus evaluation. And whichever one of the presenters wants to jump in on that, please feel free.
Joanna, do you want to jump in? Or should I? Or should we?
Go ahead.
Sure. So that's a great question, and an area we've been exploring. From my point of view, and I'm speaking from my point of view, and so others can speak, I think in my mind, evaluation, there's lots of different ways that we can use evaluation in our work. And through evaluative thinking, through different types of tools and processes and approaches that can be used throughout the life cycle, through different methodologies like developmental evaluation, for example. But at the end of the day, even in the social and public sectors, when you come to evaluating a portfolio, this idea that there's enough data out there, or that there's been enough foresight that has been established at the early program design phases to then be able to do a very robust evaluation, it's not there. And so when I think about impact measurement and management, I'm thinking about all the architecture and all the things that have to be done in the actual rolling out of the work that would enable evaluation to happen, but not that it's so dichotomously different that it's IMM versus evaluation. I see it all as a bit of a mosaic. And that there are different skill sets that you could plug and play into, but broadly speaking, that very much ladder up to managing your impact in the same way that you manage your financial performance. Mike or Joanna, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, Veronica, that's helpful. This is Joanna. I wholeheartedly agree. I think that there's not a whole lot of substantive difference. I think one way that I I do think just the way that they are being used right now in the impact investing field versus other social sector programs is different in the sense that, as Veronica said, the impact measurement and management thus far in the field, I think is probably more akin to what the evaluation field would refer to as monitoring, as opposed to using monitoring data to ask and help answer the evaluation questions, if that makes sense. So I think IMM and monitoring and evaluation, I think have the same aspiration, and they're just at kind of different levels in the history of their implementation, I think.
Okay, so at this point you would see the focus on sort of results being the same, but sort of how much attention you pay to process is different. Would that be?
Yeah.
Would that be a way to
I think that's a good way to think about it. Veronica and Mike, I don't know if you agree, disagree.
I would agree. And I think it's also about, we spend a lot of time in evaluation talking about the constructs. I almost think this is going to sound very meta, but it almost feels like the definition of evaluation has been defined out of government sector. And as it's growing out, and I see a comment by Jindra about the deepening of M&E, as it's growing out into other sectors such as impact investors and private sector investments, it's not as accountability focused, and so it's changing in the construct of what it is. But the same tools and approaches are applicable, and in fact are being used in a way that I think government is not necessarily seeing that.
Great. I have a few more questions we want to get to here. Is there a common baseline metrics established prior to tracking progress towards the SDGs? So do you assess where a project is relative to, with establish a baseline for an investment against the SDGs before you make the investment? So that you can track.
So maybe I can jump in from the investment side. So I think the answer is yes and no. It really depends on the investment. Lots of the types of companies and products that we're working with under the Zero Gap portfolio, which I mentioned is around financial innovation. These are brand new tools and products that just simply haven't existed before. So the baseline oftentimes is just zero. So for example, we recently supported something called the Forest Resilience Bond, which is mentioned in the presentation slides, which is around getting financing to manage forests to prevent the severity and frequency of forest fire in California. And that initial bond is to kind of proactively manage 15,000 acres of forest in Lake Tahoe. And obviously before that product, there was, the baseline was zero, the goal was 15,000, so it's pretty clear progress that can be tracked. I think in an investment like LeapFrog, where we came into that latest fund a little bit later than some other investors had, and so there was a baseline of number of emerging consumers impacted, of which we're trying to go above and beyond. So it really depends on the scenario, but I think to have an accurate accounting, obviously establishing a baseline should be a best practice.
Okay, great. Any other comments on that, Veronica or Joanna?
Joanna, do you want to jump in?
Nope, go ahead.
I was only going to add or underscore what Mike said, which is for the Rockefeller Foundation, we are typically investing both our traditional grant-making assets as well as our impact investments in new areas. And in these new areas, there typically is very little precedent for the work that we're doing. And so oftentimes we're investing and then building the field of the tools, approaches, and processes that would be needed in order to actually assess what it is that we're actually doing. And so it's a little bit of a nuanced response. I wonder, Joanna, how it looks for the MacArthur Foundation.
Joanna, do you want to add anything?
No, in fact, we approach baseline value very similarly as Veronica and Mike described.
Okay. So we have a question. In the context of impacting, is there a set of metrics made towards the measurement of both financial return and social impact? So how are the two related? Are you looking, or are they seen as two completely separate metrics? Are there synergies?
I'm happy to jump in on this one unless, okay, so I think from my perspective, to the extent we can link them, all the better. It's not always the case that you're able to kind of draw that exact linkage. And so maybe just sticking with the examples I've been using, I mean, I think LeapFrog, if you look at the companies, so LeapFrog is a private equity fund focused on financial services companies and healthcare businesses in parts of emerging markets. And so if you look at the companies that they're serving, the growth of those companies and the overall success of the fund, which is obviously a financial metric, is pretty explicitly tied to the customer growth of those underlying portfolio companies. And so when we talk about the number of kind of emerging consumers or emerging poor and vulnerable populations in these markets getting access to these different businesses, that's pretty well linked to the overall financial performance of the overall investment. That kind of linkage is not always kind of, you don't always have the ability to draw that direct of a line. And so if and when possible, yes, I think that's valuable. But our experience, at least my experience, has been it's not always easy to do. And sometimes you have to live with having kind of two different sets of metrics, which I think is okay as long as you're being diligent and deliberate about tracking both.
And I would only add, because it's such a critical question, really, where is the nexus between social impact, I think, and on the financial performance side, I would characterize it as scale, like our abilities to drive down costs in order to scale the hypothetical social impact that we're seeing. And I think, to me, that's a question that, as someone who's been in the research and evaluation space for some time, that I have across all of our investments. And what I've seen in government and what I've seen in the more nonprofit type of sector, we're all looking for, like, what does that look like? I think the difference on the impact investing side is that because we're being pretty diligent, at least we are being pretty diligent about tracking both financial and impact performance, we're setting ourselves up so the conditions are set to be able to do that analysis in a way that would hopefully drive better decision making. And in the space specifically, in the sector, I'm still looking for the unicorn out there, anyone who's actually doing that really, really well. Joanna, do you want to jump in there?
No, I think that's right. I think there still needs to be, speaking of evidence-based, I think more needs to kind of be borne out to understand if there is a relationship between financial return and social impact and what the relationship is, and recognizing that it doesn't always meet. So by nature of the investments that we're making, at least through MacArthur, we are expecting a concessionary financial return, right? So there are, it just adds to, again, the evidence base and the full spectrum of different types of impact investments that can be made out there, that some that will place more of an emphasis on financial return than social impact, some that have a much more kind of balanced expectation, and some that will kind of not necessarily, but will always will never kind of generate a market rate return as other conventional investments, and that's okay. But being able to set expectations appropriately, using some of the evidence that hopefully the work that MacArthur is doing and Rockefeller and other investors will help inform those conversations and decisions amongst investors. And I think, some of the people, some participants in this webinar are doing some of that work. I'm giving a shout out to Mike McCrellis, especially, who I know is looking at this in a relationship very very diligently. So I think more to come there.
Great. Yeah, I think that's been one of the ongoing sort of tensions around impact investing is how much financial return are you willing to give up for how much social return? So it's the ongoing struggle. Got another question for the Rockefeller folks, Veronica and Mike. Rockefeller grants seem to illustrate patient capital, early investments. So they're patient early investments. And the idea goal is to spur more investment grade options then. Is this a growing approach, or is the quick and more immediate ROI still what most folks are looking for?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that question. And I would say it's definitely growing, and I think thanks to lots of leadership by Joanna and the MacArthur Foundation around the Catalytic Capital Consortium, which really is this thesis of, as we would define it, kind of mid-single-digit return concessional funding that is looking, as you said, Jane, to spur broader kind of private sector participation in products and funds and mechanisms that have impact integrity. And so I definitely think it's growing as a theme. You have groups like Convergence, the Climate Policy Institute with their Climate Lab, and other groups out there, obviously C3, which I mentioned, our Zero Gap program, that are focused on this idea of product incubation and trying to basically create the ecosystem and the enabling environment to facilitate larger pools of capital who are increasingly talking more about impact and ESG. Those investors need somewhere to put their money, and so I think it's a highly catalytic use of philanthropic capital to use that to develop products that can speak to the risk return requirements of those investors. And equally as important to the points made on this webinar of providing the actual product is making sure that product has impact integrity. And that's why the issues that we're talking about here are so critical, because when these new entrants come into the space, we want to make sure that we're providing them with deal flow and investment opportunity that is well vetted from an impact perspective and is going to show them how impact monitoring evaluation can and should be done.
Okay, great. Which is kind of a nice lead into the next question that was posed here, about when you introduce the topic of evaluation into the conversation with the potential investee, and who then pays for the evaluation. How do you embed that in the conversation?
Joanna, do you want to start off?
Yeah, sure. That's a really, really good question, and I think that a lot of actors across the impact investing ecosystem, I think, are still kind of grappling with it and what are some best practices. And again, I think that at least the answer that MacArthur has landed on is it depends. I mean, the introducing the question around evaluation and our eagerness and interest in promoting evaluation is always introduced at the very beginning. I think there's always a question about, if an investee has capacity and resources to do that evaluation. And if so, that's a little bit of an easier answer, that if an investee has the capacity and resources to do it, we are very interested in supporting that. If they don't, I think there has to be conversations around whether there are other resources to tap into that could supplement or drive those activities. And if not, if for whatever reason there just aren't resources or capacity that allows that level of rigor, then it's a matter of right-sizing or managing expectations around the results that an investee is able to claim, especially around outcome level changes. Veronica and Mike, do you have anything to add there?
So we're nodding with what you just said, which is it's right-sized, right? Whether or not it's financial capacity to be able to evaluate. And our experience, I'm going to start off and Mike is going to add, and we're going to come right back to you, Joanna. Our experience is that question actually could be broken out into various different levels, right, across our full value chain. And so at the investee level, and I think that was Courtney that had asked the question, at the investee level, it's definitely based on what is the capacity and capability of the investee or the social enterprise to actually be able to not just evaluate, but measure its impact, and hopefully it has the internal capabilities of being able to do that. If not, we can definitely have a conversation about who pays for that. But when we come to evaluation, it's really the investor asking for some validation of outcomes to the investee. And so our assumption here would be that the investor would pay for it. Then we have examples of investments that we've made jointly with many other investors, because it's very rare that an investee will only have one investor. And so we have the experience of also being on joint funding investor panels, in which case we would jointly make the decision to do an evaluation, and we would probably jointly pay for it in some way, shape, or form. And then there's one more level, and I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk a little bit about that piece.
Yeah, well, maybe just briefly. So as Veronica just alluded to, that's kind of at the portfolio company level on investments we're making. I think an interesting scenario that we found ourselves in, thanks to the partnership with the MacArthur Foundation, was as we became an investee of C3, we had to consider not just the broader impact framework and associated costs, but certainly when it comes to evaluation. And as a part of that partnership, we've committed to doing an evaluation that will likely be paid primarily on our end. And I think one of the reasons why we're willing to do that, right, is we want to be able to demonstrate our own kind of success in managing that funds, and we want to demonstrate to MacArthur and the sector more broadly that we've done that efficiently and effectively. And so that is just a position that we're not used to finding ourselves in, as we're typically the investor, but I think it's been a good experience for at least me on the investment side to really understand the I don't want to say constraints, but the implications of being an investee and kind of what it comes with when partnering with a foundation like ours or like MacArthur.
And then Joanna, maybe you want to talk about the C3 evaluation that your team is thinking about.
Yeah, so I mean that's really just a thank you, Mike and Veronica. That's really helpful. And then I will just point back to my part of the webinar, which outlines our activities or our efforts to conduct evaluations of each of our strategies, including C3. So we will be bringing on an evaluation learning partner that will be taking a look at what we're trying to accomplish across the C3 initiative, which includes investing in other organizations like Rockefeller that are doing their own impact investing. So it's kind of almost like a meta evaluation of all the work that other institutional investors are going to be doing.
Interesting. Okay, got a couple of other questions here. Are any of the portfolios emphasizing a gender lens? And if so, any tips on how you would choose indicators to measure against those objectives?
So from our side, we don't have an explicit focus within our zero gap portfolio, which again is around financial innovation as kind of the main driver of the investment thesis. We don't have a gender component. However, within certain investments, if and when possible, we do include gender components. So, for example, one of the deals that we referenced in the slides is the 6-Up transaction, and so we've included in those indicators an understanding of, okay, from a financing gap perspective, how many of these underserved students are female, and kind of, if possible, where are they based geographically throughout the country to help target the efforts of the company. And then going beyond just the scaling of the actual gap is, okay, how many female students is 6-Up actually supporting? It can get tricky in that sort of scenario just given certain privacy constraints around student loans, but that withstanding, I think it's an example of where we were kind of very focused on, when possible, getting detail on gender more broadly, but it's not an explicit focus of our impact investing portfolio here at the Foundation.
And I would only add, so another one of our investments called the Women Livelihood Fund is is actually very much focused on empowering women and ensuring economic opportunities for them. And I would say, at the point at which an investee at times becomes an investee for us, they, like LeapFrog, but different, they have a full-on methodology that they're using to track their impact. And rather than have a different set of indicators that would add additional reporting burden onto that, we very much look to them to work with us to advise us on what would make sense for them, so that they can continue to keep their resourcing focused, laser focused on the type of financial and social performance that they're trying to drive across their portfolios.
Okay, great, thank you. If you think about starting to get evaluators and investment officers at foundations working together more closely, curious about what you see as the benefits and challenges with that working relationship. So here's where you can dish on each other.
Joanna, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Well, I think from the benefit side of things, I think that as Veronica said, a lot of this has to do with setting up the architecture or the systems and the practices that should be in place in order to generate the type of data and information that can actually be meaningful and useful to individual investments, portfolios of investments, to a foundation strategy overall. So being able to join my impact investment team, my impact investing colleagues from the beginning, in those beginning stages. As we all know, right, monitoring and evaluation doesn't happen. It's not an afterthought, right? It really starts from the design stage all the way through, the implementation and exit. And so working together with them from the beginning of a strategy and having some of those planning conversations so we can put the right foundations in place that will ultimately allow us to get the information we need is so helpful. I think from my personal experience, and every organization will be different, I think the challenges with that is that I am working on a number of different strategies, and so sometimes I'm just not able to spend as much time on our impact investing work as I would like to have those really comprehensive conversations and to see them through into operationalizing them. And so it is a tricky balance around making sure you have the right tools in place and being able to have the time and space to test them out and refine them.
Yeah, so maybe from the Rockefeller perspective, we obviously, as you heard from my comments, it's incredibly valuable to be able to work with folks like Veronica and Joanna on a more regular basis. I think I made this point on the prep call, and maybe I'll make it again here, is, as being the Rockefeller Foundation or the MacArthur Foundation, I think people give us a bit of a pass when it comes to impact. They just assume that everything we're doing is inherently impactful, and certainly in the impact investing space, I can vouch for that. Just having the Rockefeller brand, people just kind of stamp it with a seal of approval around impact, which obviously is well and good, but I think we want to make sure that we have the data and the systems and results to back that up, and my team doesn't have the expertise to do that, and therefore rely pretty heavily on Veronica and her team here within the foundation. I think echoing Joanna's point maybe at the end there, I think part of the struggle within a big foundation like ours is we have a relatively, in my opinion, small M&E team compared to the breadth of our programming and the ambition, certainly, of our programming. And so I think we're asking a lot of our M&E team. And so as we look to grow our portfolio, we've kind of actively been talking about, does it make sense to bring in some resources, even within our team specifically, as some dedicated support that can work with Veronica hand in hand to kind of build out our capacity in this space within the innovative finance portfolio?
Yes, and I'll just really quickly say, you know, it's such a pleasure to work with teams that know their craft really well, and when you come together, the synergy is really there versus scenarios where that's not the case. You know, and I think that one of the pluses that ideally we would want to build into some type of impact analyst or portfolio analyst is the ability to know who are the people out there that know how to do this well. What are the tools and frameworks all about? You may have heard things like the Impact Management Project, IMP, in this conversation, but in the space we're talking about IRIS Plus, which is an inventory of indicators. We're talking about ISC principles, which is a little bit around impact management and operationalizing that at the global development level. We're talking about ESG. So there's a lot of lingo that one needs to really know, and that one is not the keeper of. And so when we come together across different teams, we very much leverage each other's sector expertise in a way that makes us a more of a well-oiled machine.
Okay, great. So I'm curious about the SDGs. You've referenced using the Sustainable Development Goals as the core framework there. And maybe you could all comment on to what extent is that actually helping to provide some common language. My sense is that the SDGs haven't gotten as much traction in the general evaluation field. And curious about your thoughts on that.
So we're looking at each other. Maybe Mike, we have like a few minutes, so we'll just go really fast, rapid fire.
Yeah, we've got like 3 minutes left. So.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just say from the investment side, I think Jane, your point is absolutely right. The SDGs as a kind of commonly accepted framework and language for impact has certainly taken off. Of course, that breeds concerns around whitewashing or greenwashing or whatever washing you want to call it. But at the very least, and this is the point I like to make, at the very least, you have the mainstream financial players referring to the SDGs. I don't think any of us could have imagined that would have been the case 3 or 4 years ago, and so I think that's progress. But obviously, we have to make sure they're going a step beyond just including it in their presentation.
Yes, and I would say that in this conversation several years ago, one of the challenges with actually even managing your impact at the impact investing level was that there was no real agreement as to, you know, what framework one would use, and you would spend a really long time with bespoke approaches, frameworks, and methods in a way that wouldn't make sense to anybody else but your own team. And so what the SDGs has done in terms of a global framework is helped us to not spend a lot of time having those conversations and jump right in and say, these are the indicators that are helpful. These are the impacts that we need to see in order to see traction with people and planet. Let's just start there. And when you start, you get a little bit more nuance in your work, but you need to start somewhere, and I think that the SDG framework allows that to happen.
Okay, great. All right, we are just about out of time here, so I want to just take a moment to thank you all. John Sherman, who was to be one of our co-hosts for this, had some technical difficulties, so he asked that we extend thanks on his behalf also to all of our participants and to our presenters. As we said in the beginning, this is part of a 3-webinar series, and our next webinar will be October 10th at 11 o'clock. I encourage everyone to go to the Johnson Center website. You can find the links to register for that. And we will be sending out a link to the recording of the webinar and the slides to everybody who registered. So with that, we're going to wrap it up and hope to see you and hear many of you on October 10th. And presenters really appreciate your time and contributions to the field.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.